Hey, it's Nathan. Before we start, I want you to think about something most people never think about, which is that your body has paperwork. Somewhere in a database you have never seen, there is a file that says what you are made of. And that file can be right or it can be wrong. And if it is wrong, the wrongness will sit there quietly for years, doing nothing, until the one day in your life when you need it to be right. Today's story is about a man who found out that his file was wrong on the worst possible morning, in the worst possible room, and that it had been made wrong on purpose, by two people who knew exactly what they were stealing from him. It is also about the thing they did not account for, which is that he spent his whole working life around a very specific kind of honesty. Not the human kind, the mechanical kind, the kind that runs on batteries in the corner of a cold box and does not care who is asking. Stick with me on this one, because it starts in a hospital hallway and it ends somewhere I promise you will not see coming, and because I think by the end you will understand why he says the sentence he says at the very end, and why it is not a threat. It's a description of how the world actually works, if you are patient enough. Emmett Denham had been awake for 26 hours when the surgeon looked up from the paper and stopped being a person for a second. He noticed it the way he noticed everything, which was late and completely. Emmett was not a fast man. He had been told this his whole life, first by teachers who mistook it for slowness, and later by his father, who corrected them. Wendell Denham had run a 2-truck refrigerated freight outfit out of a gravel lot in Tolliver, Ohio, for 31 years, and he had a way of explaining his son that shut people up. "The boy isn't slow," Wendell would say. "He's just checking." There's a difference between a man who doesn't know the answer and a man who won't say it until he's sure. Emmett had inherited the lot, the 2 trucks, and the checking. By the time he was 38, Denham Cold Chain was 4 trucks and a validated storage room, and it did the kind of work that nobody notices until it fails. Vaccines to county health departments, whole blood and platelets to 3 rural hospitals that could not afford their own courier, research specimens, tissue for the bone bank, and twice a year, when the Regional Organ Recovery Organization was short-handed, a run that mattered more than the rest of them combined. Every load left the dock with a data logger in the box. Every logger recorded temperature every 60 seconds and wrote it to a file nobody could edit, and when the box arrived, that file went into a folder with the seal number and 2 photographs and a signature. Emmett had a saying he used on new drivers, and it embarrassed him a little to hear himself say it, because it was his father's saying and he had not improved it. "You can lie to a person," he would say. "You cannot lie to a data logger." He believed it the way other men believe in things with candles. His marriage had ended 4 years earlier in a lawyer's office in Columbus with a folding table and a box of tissues that nobody used. Tessa had been married to him for 7 years by then, and he could still not tell you the exact month it went wrong, only that it went wrong the way a load goes wrong. Not with a bang, but with a slow drift out of range that you don't catch until you read the file afterward and see that the numbers had been climbing for a very long time. She had wanted a different life. That was the honest version. And Emmett had eventually made himself say it out loud, because the dishonest version, the one where she was simply cruel, was easier and therefore probably wrong. Tessa Vandermeer had grown up in a house where the good dishes came out for people who mattered and stayed in the cabinet for everyone else, and she had married a man who smelled like diesel and dry ice, and who thought a Good Friday was one where nothing thawed. She had worked as a medical records clerk at a clinic in Columbus, and she had talked, near the end, about a bigger city, about people who did things, about a version of herself that had a passport with stamps in it. The thing Emmett could not forgive was not the leaving, it was the sentence. They had been standing in the driveway. Marin was 5 and buckled into the back seat of a car Emmett did not recognize, coloring, unaware, the way 5-year-olds are mercifully unaware. Tessa had put the last bag in the trunk and closed it and looked at him with an expression he had spent 4 years trying to describe to himself and had finally settled on. She looked relieved. "She'll never ask about you," Tessa said, and then she got in the car and drove to Colorado. People who hear this story ask the same question, and they ask it in a tone that has a small blade in it. Why didn't he fight? He did. He fought for 11 months, quietly, badly, with a lawyer he could not afford and a case that fell apart in stages. He fought until the afternoon Tessa's attorney slid a piece of paper across a table and told him, in the flat voice people use for weather, that if he continued, there would be an allegation. Not a true one, a filed one. And that a filed allegation would follow him, and follow the trucks, and follow the contracts that required background checks, and that it would sit in the same room as his daughter for years while adults argued about it. He asked one question. He asked what it would do to Marin. The lawyer did not answer, which was an answer. Emmett went home and sat in the cab of the older truck in the dark for a long time with the engine off. Then he stopped. He never stopped paying. Not 1 month, not once. Not even the winter the transmission went out of Unit 2, and he slept in the shop for 9 days. And he never stopped writing. Every Sunday night, at the kitchen table, in pen, because his father had told him that a typed letter is a document and a handwritten letter is a person. He kept copies. He was a man who kept copies of everything. By the 4th year, there were 208 letters in a banker's box under the stairs, and every single one of them had come back, and not one of them had been opened. He kept writing anyway. That is the part people find strange, and it is the part that explains everything else about him. The call came on a Tuesday in March, at 7:41 in the evening, while he was hosing down the dock. It was not Tessa. It was a woman named Sunny Alfaro, who introduced herself as a pediatric transplant coordinator at Belhaven Children's in Minneapolis, and who spoke in the careful, level way of a person who has made this call before and has learned that speed is a kind of cruelty. She asked if he was the father of Emmett Denham, date of birth listed, and Emmett said yes, and then had to put his hand on the wall. Marin was 9. She had been diagnosed 4.5 years earlier with a kidney disease Emmett had never heard of before that phone call, and could now spell in his sleep, focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, a scarring condition that eats the filters of the kidney a little at a time. It had been caught early. It had been managed, then not managed. She had been on dialysis since November. Since November. He wrote the word on the back of a fuel receipt so he could look at it later and decide what to do with it. Sunny Alfaro said the family had asked her to expand the donor search. She said it the way you say a thing you have been instructed to say. She said the recipient's mother had provided contact information for the biological father, and Emmett understood, in the cold arithmetic way he understood loads and hours, that Tessa had run out of options, and he was the last one on the list. He did not care. That was the thing he would try to explain later and never quite manage. He did not care that he was the last option. He was an option. That was the entire content of his mind for the next several minutes. He asked what he had to do. She said come to Minneapolis for tissue typing and a donor workup, that it took several days, that most people fly. Emmett looked at the clock. He looked at the yard. He called Booker Nance, who had driven for his father and now drove for him, and who was 61 years old, and had never once asked a question that wasn't necessary. And he said, Book, I need the Friday run covered, and I need it covered for 2 weeks. Booker said okay. Then Booker said, is it the girl? And Emmett said yes. And Booker said, go. He left at 9:20 that night in his own pickup with a duffel bag and 4 bottles of water and the banker's box of letters on the passenger seat, because he could not think of a reason to leave them and could not stop himself from bringing them. Ohio to Minnesota is a long night. He drove it in one piece. Toledo, then the long dark bend of Indiana, then Chicago at 2 in the morning with the skyline off to the right like a circuit board, then Wisconsin, which went on forever, then the sky going gray somewhere past Eau Claire. He did not listen to music. He rehearsed sentences. He rehearsed what he would say to Marin and threw all of it away, and then he rehearsed what he would say to Tessa and threw that away too. And by the time he crossed the river into Minneapolis, at 8:05 in the morning, the only thing he had left was a very simple plan, which was to be useful and to say nothing else. Belhaven Children's Hospital was a good building. That was his first thought, and it shamed him a little for its smallness. But he was a man who spent his life in loading docks and cold rooms, and he could not help noticing that the floors were level and the air handling was quiet, and the lobby smelled like nothing at all, which is very hard and very expensive to achieve. Tessa was in the 4th floor waiting area with a coffee she wasn't drinking. She had changed, and the change was not what he expected. He had built a version of her in his head over 4 years, a glossy one, and the woman in front of him was thinner than that version and older than 4 years should have made her. and had the particular exhausted stillness of a parent who has been living in hospitals. For about 6 seconds, Emmett felt something soften in his chest, and he hated it, and then it passed. She said, "You came." He said, "Where is she?" A man stood up beside her. He was maybe 46, silver at the temples in a way that looked scheduled, in a quarter zip that cost more than the tires on Emmett's truck. He put out a hand and said, "Porter Halcomb," and then, because some men cannot help themselves, he added, "I'm Marin's dad." Emmett looked at the hand until Porter took it back. Porter Halcomb ran a company called Halcomb Vantage. Emmett would learn the details later. At the time, all he retained was the phrase Porter used, which was medical concierge and transplant facilitation, and the fact that Porter said it the way people say a thing they have said at parties. Porter explained, unasked, that he had personally made calls to 3 centers, that he had a relationship with a program in Istanbul, that there were options, and that this workup was, in his word, thorough, which he pronounced like a small apology for how unnecessary it was. Emmett said, "I'd like to see my daughter." Tessa said, "She's sleeping," and Emmett said, "Then I'll sit there while she sleeps," and something in the way he said it made Porter step aside. Marin was not sleeping. She was 9, and small for 9, with a dialysis catheter dressing at her collarbone and a tablet propped on her knees. And when Emmett came through the door, she looked up and did the thing that broke him, which was that she did not look confused. She looked like someone checking a photograph against a face. She said, "Are you Emmett?" He said, "I'm your dad." She thought about it. Then she said, "Okay," and moved her feet over so he could sit on the end of the bed. They talked for 40 minutes about nothing. About a show she liked with a girl who fixes robots. About the hospital's food, which she rated honestly and harshly. About whether Ohio had mountains, which it does not. At one point, a nurse came in and adjusted a line, and Marin narrated the whole procedure to him like a tour guide, and Emmett understood that this was a child who had learned to make medicine into a subject she was good at, because that was better than it being a thing that happened to her. Near the end, she got quiet and said, without looking at him, "Mom said you didn't want to get tested." Emmett sat with that. He had promised himself in the truck that he would not say a single bad word about Tessa in front of Marin. Not one, not ever. And he found that he could keep the promise and still tell the truth, and the discovery felt like finding a tool in his hand that he did not remember picking up. He said, "I drove all night to get tested. I left 12 minutes after I found out." Marin considered this. Then she said, "Okay," in the exact same tone as before, and went back to the tablet, and Emmett realized his hands were shaking and put them under his legs. The workup started that afternoon. A living donor workup is not one test. It is a slow, deliberate interrogation of a body, and Emmett, who spent his life proving that a box had stayed cold, respected it immediately. They took blood, a great deal of blood, in tubes with different colored tops, in a specific order. They took urine over 24 hours in a jug he had to keep on ice, which he found funny in a way nobody else in the room did. They imaged his kidneys with ultrasound, and then with a CT scan that used contrast and made him feel briefly, weirdly warm. They ran his heart. They ran his liver. A social worker asked him, gently and repeatedly, whether anyone was pressuring him or paying him, and he understood that this was a real question, with real reasons behind it, and he answered it seriously each time, and they typed his tissue. Human leukocyte antigen typing is the part of the process that people misunderstand. It is not a blood type. It is closer to a signature. The HLA genes sit in a dense cluster on chromosome 6, and they are wildly variable between people, and modern typing reads them at the allele level, which means the report is not a rough family resemblance. It is a string of specific numbers that is, for practical purposes, unique to you and to your identical twin if you have one. You inherit one full set from your mother and one from your father. That is why a biological parent is always exactly a half match to their child. Never more, never less. It is arithmetic. The lab at Belhaven ran his sample on a Wednesday. Dr. Solveig Haugen was the pediatric transplant surgeon, 44 years old, with a way of standing very still that Emmett recognized because he did it himself. She had trained in Oslo and Pittsburgh, and she had the reputation, among the coordinators, of being the person you wanted in the room when something went wrong, because she got quieter instead of louder. On Thursday morning, she called Emmett to a small consultation room on the 4th floor. Tessa and Porter came too, because Tessa was the recipient's guardian, and because Porter went everywhere. Dr. Haugen had a printout. She was reading it when they came in, and she kept reading it for 11 more seconds after they sat down, which Emmett counted, because he counts. Then she looked up and stopped. It was the smallest thing. Her face did not change, but she went still in the middle of a breath, the way a person does when they have just heard a sound in a house they thought was empty. She said, "Mr. Denham, I'd like to run this again." Porter cheerfully said, "Is it bad news?" Dr. Haugen said, "It's not news yet." She left. She was gone 80 minutes. When she came back, she asked Emmett to confirm his date of birth, his full legal name, his social security number, his mother's maiden name, and whether he had ever been hospitalized, and she asked all of it with a pen in her hand, and without once explaining why. Emmett answered every question, and did not ask a single one, and later Dr. Haugen would tell him that this was the moment she decided he was not involved. Because guilty people ask what's wrong immediately, and innocent people who are terrified just answer. She said, "I'm sending your sample to an outside reference laboratory, Kettleridge Immunogenetics in Chicago. They'll run it independently, blinded, with a fresh draw." Tessa said, "Is something wrong with his kidneys?" Dr. Haugen said, "His kidneys are excellent," and something about the way she said it, the flat precision of it, made the room colder. They drew Emmett again that afternoon. 2 tubes, sealed and initialed in front of him, into a validated shipper with a logger in it. He watched them pack it and he could not stop himself. He said, "That's a 48-hour phase change pack. You've got it against the sample wall." And the tech looked at him, and Emmett said, "Sorry, I do cold chain." The tech moved the pack. 2 days passed. Emmett spent them in Marin's room. He learned that she called dialysis the vampire, and the nurses the coven, and that she had a list on her tablet of things she would do when she had a new kidney, and that number 4 on the list was drink a whole entire large soda, and that number 7 was see my dad's trucks. He read that one twice and then had to go stand in the hallway. He also watched Tessa and Porter, because he could not help it. They were not a happy couple. That surprised him. There was a rhythm between them that he recognized from bad partnerships in business. The constant low-level management, the way Tessa checked Porter's face before she spoke, the way Porter's warmth switched on for the staff and off in the elevator. Once, in the cafeteria, Emmett heard Porter say into his phone, "Not now." And then, after a pause, in a completely different voice, "I said the Vantage side handles it," and hung up so fast the phone made a noise. On Saturday at 4:50 in the afternoon, Kettleridge called back. Emmett was in the hallway getting coffee out of a machine that gave you a stir stick whether you wanted one or not. He saw Dr. Haugen at the nurse's station take the call, and he watched her write something on a sticky note, and then he watched her look at the note for a long moment and then fold it in half, which struck him as an odd thing to do with information. She did not come to him. She walked past him and into a stairwell. 20 minutes later, Sonny Alfaro found him and said, in a voice that had lost its practiced calm around the edges, "Mr. Denham, there's going to be a meeting Monday morning. Dr. Haugen has asked the hospital ethics committee to convene." Emmett said, "For a tissue type." Sonny said, "I'm not able to explain it." She looked at him then, and she was 31 years old, and out of her depth and honest about it, and she said, "I've worked here 6 years. I have never seen her do this." Emmett went back to the room and sat with his daughter, and did not say anything about any of it, because she was 9, and because he had a rule about what children should have to carry. That night he did what he always did when a number did not make sense, which was to go find the raw data. He could not get his own lab report. He was not, it turned out, entitled to see the registry entries the hospital had queried on his behalf. Not yet. Not without a process. So he went at it from the side, the way you approach a bad load. Not by asking what happened, but by asking what would have to be true for this to happen. He sat in his truck in a parking ramp on 6th Street, with a legal pad, and wrote a single line at the top. What result would make a surgeon call an ethics committee about a healthy donor? He wrote for 2 hours. He got nowhere. He was a freight man, not a doctor. But he wrote one thing near the bottom of the page that turned out to be exactly right, and he wrote it because it was the only kind of problem he actually understood. "It's not about my kidneys," he wrote. "It's about my paperwork." The ethics committee met on Monday at 8 o'clock in a room on the second floor with a long table and a whiteboard nobody had erased properly. There were 9 people. Dr. Odalis Prieto chaired it. She was a palliative care physician in her 60s, with reading glasses on a chain and the manner of a woman who has told several thousand families the truth. There was a hospital attorney named Fitzgerald Amaro, who went by Fitz, and who took notes with a fountain pen. There was a nephrologist, Dr. Anselm Boyko. There was Dr. Emil Roundtree, who ran the histocompatibility laboratory and who looked like he had not slept. There was a chaplain, a nurse ethicist, a patient representative, a bioethicist from the university, and Dr. Haugen. Emmett was asked to come at 8:45. Tessa and Porter were asked to come at 9. That ordering was deliberate, and Emmett noticed it and filed it. Dr. Prieto began by saying that nothing said in the room was an accusation, that the committee's function was to determine whether a proposed donation could ethically proceed, and that if at any point Mr. Denham wished to leave or to have counsel, the meeting would stop. Then Dr. Haugen slid 2 pages across the table. She said, "Mr. Denham, on Wednesday we typed your tissue. The result was internally consistent and technically clean. Class 1 and Class 2, allele level." She tapped the first page. "This is you. There is nothing unusual about it except one thing, which is that you carry a fairly uncommon combination that our software flagged for a probability check." Emmett said, "Okay." She said, "When we entered you as a prospective living donor, the national system returned a match. Not a match to your daughter, a match to a record." She slid the second page. She said, "According to the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network, a living donor named Emmett Denham, with your date of birth and your social security number, underwent a left donor nephrectomy on the 3rd of September, 2023, at a facility called Cascade Meridian Surgical in Henderson, Nevada. That donor is enrolled in mandatory 2-year follow-up. There are labs on file. There is a consent packet on file. There is a discharge summary." The room was very quiet. Emmett said, "I've never been to Nevada." Dr. Haugen said, "I know. On Wednesday we imaged you. You have 2 kidneys. Normal size, normal split function, no surgical history, no scar, no adhesions, nothing." And Dr. Roundtree pulled the HLA typing attached to that 2023 donor record. She looked at Dr. Roundtree. Roundtree said, in the voice of a man who had spent the weekend arguing with a computer, "It isn't him. It's not close. Different at every locus. It is a different human being." He put his hands flat on the table. He said, "So on Thursday I had a choice. Either my instrument was wrong, or the National Registry was wrong, or the man sitting here is lying about who he is. I ran him 3 times. I sent him blinded to Kettleridge, who has no idea what any of this is about. Kettleridge returned an identical result to mine on Saturday afternoon." He looked up. He said, "Which leaves me holding 2 different tissue types under one name, 1 social security number, and 1 date of birth. One of those people donated a kidney 3 years ago. One of them is sitting in this room with both of his." Nobody said anything. Then Dr. Roundtree said the sentence that Emmett would carry around for the rest of his life, and he said it not dramatically but with a kind of professional despair, the way an engineer says a bridge is moving. He said, "This result cannot exist." Dr. Prieto let it sit for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Denham, do you understand what we are telling you?" And Emmett, who was slow and who checked, sat very still and let the pieces come down in order, the way they do when you finally read the file and see the temperature curve, and understand not just that the load failed but when, and therefore who was driving. He said, "Somebody had surgery under my name." Dr. Prieto said, "That is one possibility." Emmett said, a real person with a real kidney, and they took it out, and they wrote my name on it." Fitzamaro stopped writing. Emmett said, "And if I'm a registered living donor, then I can't donate, can I?" Dr. Haugen said, quietly, "No. Under the current record, you are ineligible. A single kidney donor cannot donate. The system would reject the workup automatically." "It nearly did," Emmett said, "and my daughter has been on dialysis since November." Nobody answered that, because there was no answer that was not obscene. He asked one more question, and he asked it in the flat voice his drivers knew, the one that meant he had stopped being upset and started being exact. He said, "When was that record created?" Roundtree checked. He said, The donor registration was entered on the 19th of August, 2023. The typing on file was uploaded the same day. Emmett said, "And when was my tissue type first put into any system anywhere?" Roundtree looked at him. Emmett said, "Because it was." In 2021, at Bellwether Typing Laboratory in Columbus, Ohio, my daughter was 4. She'd just been diagnosed. Her nephrologist typed her and typed me at the same time, because they wanted to know if I'd be a match if it ever came to this. He said it very carefully. He said, "My ex-wife worked in medical records. She pulled that file 11 days before she left, and I know that because when I finally got a copy of the release log 2 years later, in a custody fight I lost, her employee number was on it and nobody thought it meant anything, including me." Dr. Prieto took off her glasses. At 9 o'clock, Tessa and Porter came in. They were told, in careful language, that a serious irregularity had been identified in the national donor record associated with Mr. Denham's identity, and that the transplant could not proceed under the current record, and that the hospital was obligated to report the matter to federal authorities. Porter's reaction was interesting. He did not ask what the irregularity was. He asked who else had been told. Emmett watched him ask it. He watched Fitzamaro watch him ask it. And he understood that a room full of doctors had just learned something without anyone saying a word. The way you learn a load was opened when the seal number doesn't match the manifest. Tessa said, "I don't understand. What does this have to do with Emmett?" And Dr. Haugen, who had been silent for 11 minutes, and who had spent the weekend reading a consent packet from a surgical center in Nevada, opened a folder and turned one page around so it faced the middle of the table. It was a witness signature line at the bottom of a living donor consent form dated the 3rd of September, 2023. She said 7 words. She said, "Mrs. Halcombe, your husband signed this consent. There is a thing that happens to a person when a sentence lands on them in public and they cannot afford to react." Emmett had seen it once before, on a dock in Cincinnati, when a warehouse manager was told in front of his crew that the camera over the bay had been working the whole time. The face does not fall, the face holds. It is the hands that go. Tessa's hands went. She said, "That's not his signature." And Porter said, "Tess." And she said it again, louder. And Porter said her name a 3rd time in a tone Emmett recognized instantly, because it was the tone of a man telling a dog to sit. Porter Halcombe stood up, buttoned his jacket, and said that this meeting was over, that they would be responding through counsel, and that he wanted it on the record that a child's life was being delayed by a clerical error. He said the phrase clerical error twice. Then he walked out, and Tessa sat there for 4 seconds looking at the paper, and then she followed him, and the door closed. Fitzamaro wrote something down and underlined it. Dr. Prieto said, "Mr. Denham, do you have a lawyer?" Emmett said, "I have a freight lawyer in Zanesville who does contract disputes." Dr. Prieto said, "Get a better one. And I say that with respect." What followed was 11 days that Emmett would later describe as the worst professional experience of his life, which was a strange way to describe it, but it was accurate, because he handled it like a job, and jobs are how he survived things. Halcombe Vantage moved first, and moved hard. Within 72 hours, Emmett was served with an emergency petition in Colorado, seeking to bar him from contact with Marin, supported by an affidavit from Tessa, describing him as an unstable man who had appeared at a hospital after 4 years of no involvement, who had made accusations against her family, and who had a documented history of aggressive behavior. The documented history consisted of one incident from 2019 in which Emmett had raised his voice in a parking lot at a driver who had switched off a reefer unit to save fuel and spoiled $11,000 of vaccine. There was no police report. There was a written warning in his own personnel file, written by him, about himself, because that was the kind of man he was, and Tessa's attorney had attached it as an exhibit. Belhaven's legal department also received a letter suggesting that Dr. Haugen had made defamatory statements in a clinical setting, and a separate letter to the hospital board noting that the Halcombe Family Foundation had been considering a naming gift to the dialysis unit. Emmett read all of it in a motel room off Highway 55 with the curtains open. Then he called a woman named Constance, who ran the compliance side of a pharmaceutical distributor he hauled for, and asked her one question. "Who do you call when someone has committed fraud inside a federal health program?" She gave him a name. The name gave him another name. On the fourth call, he reached a special agent with the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General, named Delia Okonkwo, who listened for 6 minutes without interrupting, and then said, "Mr. Denham, I want you to stop talking and start writing, and I want you to send me nothing you cannot prove." That sentence did more for him than any amount of sympathy. He got a real lawyer, too, on Dr. Prieto's recommendation. A woman in Minneapolis named Callista Marrow, who had spent 9 years as regional counsel for an organ procurement organization before going into private practice, and who understood the National Organ Transplant Act the way Emmett understood a bill of lading. Marrow's first advice was blunt. She said, "They will try to make this about custody, because custody is emotional and fraud is arithmetic, and juries and judges get tired in different ways. Do not let them move the field." Her second piece of advice was better. She said, "You're not going to win by proving you're a good father. You're going to win by proving that a specific human being was cut open on a specific date in a specific building, and that the paper says it was you." So Emmett went to work on the paper. He started where he always started, which was with the timeline, because a timeline is just a temperature curve with dates instead of degrees. In April of 2021, Emmett Denham, age 4, was diagnosed at a pediatric nephrology clinic in Columbus. As part of planning for eventual transplant, both parents were HLA typed at Bellwether Typing Laboratory. Emmett's report showed he was, as expected, a half-match to his daughter, and the report also flagged that his particular allele combination was uncommon in the donor pool, which at the time had meant nothing to anyone. In July of 2021, Tessa Denham, employed as a medical records clerk at a clinic that shared an electronic system with that nephrology practice, accessed the file. Her employee number appeared in the audit log at 6:12 in the evening, after hours, on a Thursday. She accessed it twice more that week. She did not have a treatment relationship with the patient. It was, on its face, a HIPAA violation that nobody had ever noticed because nothing had ever come of it. In August of 2021, she left with Marin. In November of 2021, she met Porter Halcomb at a fundraiser in Denver. He was 42 and recently divorced with a 16-year-old daughter, and he was, in his own description, in international patient services. They married in June of 2022. In August of 2023, a living donor record was created in the national system in the name of Emmett Denham. In September of 2023, a kidney was recovered from a living donor at Cascade Meridian Surgical in Henderson, Nevada, and transplanted into a 58-year-old man from Kuwait who had flown in 9 days earlier and flown out 11 days later. Emmett laid the dates out on a motel bedspread on index cards and stood over them for a long time. Then he saw it, and when he saw it, he had to sit down on the edge of the bed, because it was worse than fraud. Fraud is about money. This was about him. They had not picked his name at random. His HLA type was uncommon. It was documented. It was attached to a real man with a real social security number, a clean record, a business, a credit history, and, most importantly, a man who would never in 1,000 years walk into a hospital and get typed again, because his daughter had been taken away, and he had been told she would never ask about him. He was the perfect ghost. He had been chosen because he was invisible. And there was one more layer, and it arrived quietly, the way the worst ones do. If Emmett Denham was on file as a living donor with one kidney, then on the day Marin's kidneys failed, the one man on earth who was a guaranteed half-match, healthy, motivated, and free, would be automatically disqualified by a computer before a single human being looked at him. They had not just stolen his identity, they had removed him from the list of people who could save his daughter 4 years before she needed saving. And they had done it on purpose, because a man who saves your child is a man who is back in your life forever. Delia Okonkwo's investigation moved at the speed of federal paper, which is to say it moved, but not the way a man whose daughter is on dialysis needs it to move. She subpoenaed the donor file from Cascade Meridian Surgical. Cascade Meridian was an ambulatory surgical center in a beige building in Henderson, Nevada, with a physician owner named Dr. Wallace Krogh, who had been quietly disciplined twice in 2 states, and who had a very good lawyer. What came back was almost perfect. That was the thing that impressed Emmett in a way that made his skin crawl. The consent packet was complete. The psychosocial evaluation was there. The independent donor advocate had signed. There was a photocopy of an Ohio driver's license with Emmett's name, Emmett's number, Emmett's date of birth, and a photograph of a man Emmett had never seen. Brown eyes, a young face, maybe 24, with the flat expression of somebody being told to hold still. Emmett looked at that photograph for a long time. He said, out loud, to nobody, in a motel room, "I'm sorry." Callista Merrow's paralegal found him in 19 days, and the way she found him was almost stupidly simple. Living donors are enrolled in mandatory follow-up. Somebody at Cascade Meridian had to submit 6-month and 1-year labs for the donor named Emmett Denham, or the center's numbers would look wrong. So they had submitted them, and the labs had been drawn at a walk-in clinic in Yuma, Arizona, because the man they were drawing them from actually lived there and it was cheaper than flying him. His name was Teodoro Salcido. Everybody called him Teo. He was 27 now, 24 then. He worked in a produce cold storage warehouse outside Yuma, which Emmett would later think about a great deal, because of all the coincidences in this story, that one was the one that felt like the world making a point. Emmett flew to Yuma. He did not tell Okonkwo first, which Okonkwo later told him was a mistake, and he accepted that, and he would do it again. Teo lived in a 2-bedroom rental with his sister and her kids. He was thin in the specific way that Emmett had learned to recognize on the 4th floor at Bellhaven, the ashy tiredness of somebody whose remaining kidney is not keeping up. He had swelling in his ankles. He had a headache he described as constant, and which he had been treating with ibuprofen, which is roughly the worst thing a person in his condition can do. He did not want to talk. Then he saw Emmett's driver's license, and he sat down on the step. He said, "They told me the name was a gift. That was how it worked, and it took an hour to get all of it. A man had come to the warehouse. Not a stranger, a co-worker's cousin, which is how these things always start. There was a program," he said, "for people who wanted to help someone and get help back. $18,000, cash, and they would cover everything, and it was legal in the sense that everything they made him sign was a real document. The only thing was that the paperwork had to say he was somebody else, because of the rules about how donors and patients have to know each other. That's all it is," they told him. "A rule about names. The kidney is real. Your kindness is real. The name is paperwork." He had a mother in Sonora with diabetes and a bill he could not pay. They gave him a folder to study. He had to know Emmett Denham's date of birth. He had to know the name of a street in Tolliver, Ohio. He had to say, if asked, that the recipient was a family friend from church. He said, "I practiced in the car." They flew him to Las Vegas. They put him in a hotel for 2 nights. He signed everything as Emmett Denham. He came out of surgery on a Sunday. He was discharged on a Tuesday with a prescription and a phone number that stopped working in 5 months. $18,000. He got 11 because there were deductions he did not understand and did not argue about. And then, and this is the part where Emmett had to walk away and stand by the fence for a minute, Teo Salcido had a medical problem 2 years later and went to an emergency room and told them he had donated a kidney, and they looked, and there was no record, because the record was under a different man's name in a different state. So the chart said, "Patient reports history of nephrectomy, unable to verify." And the follow-up he was legally entitled to as a living donor, the free lifetime monitoring, the priority on the waiting list if his remaining kidney ever failed. All of it belonged to a man in Ohio who did not know it existed. They had not just stolen Emmett's identity, they had stolen Teo's. Emmett drove him to a nephrologist in Phoenix that week and paid for it and did not tell anyone he had. And Callista Merrow found out 3 months later and told him it was the single most legally reckless act of generosity she had ever seen and that she was glad he did it. Teo agreed to talk to Okonkwo. That changed everything, because until then the government had documents. Now it had a person with a scar. The second thing that changed everything arrived in an envelope. Neve Halcombe was 16. She was Porter's daughter from his first marriage, and she lived with her mother in Boulder and spent alternating weekends in a house she referred to, in the letter, as the museum. She had found Emmett's business address on the Denham Cold Chain website. She had mailed it, physically, with a stamp, which suggested she had thought about metadata. The letter said that she had been in her father's home office in October, looking for a phone charger, and had opened a drawer, and that what was in the drawer was a spiral notebook. and that the notebook was not what a person would expect a man like her father to keep, which was exactly why he kept it. Porter Halcombe did not trust his own systems. He had been an insurance adjuster before he had been anything else, and he had a deeply old-fashioned belief that the only ledger that cannot be subpoenaed out of the cloud is one in a drawer. Every case had a line. Each line had a date, a 2-letter code for the surgical center, a first name, a second name in parentheses, and a number. Neve had photographed 11 pages before she heard the garage door. She wrote, "I don't know what most of it means, but my dad's handwriting says TS on a K, and then 11,000, and then a check mark, and I know Tessa's kid needs a kidney, and I looked up what a nephrectomy is, and I have been throwing up for 2 days. I am not doing this to be brave. I am doing it because I want to be able to have my own kids someday without wondering." There were 41 lines across the 11 pages, 41 names in parentheses, 41 people who did not know that somebody else's body had been billed to their name. Emmett sat at his kitchen table in Tolliver, Ohio, with 11 photographs printed on ordinary paper, and he understood that this had stopped being about him 3 pages ago. Then he did the thing that made the difference, and he did it because he was, at bottom, a logistics man. And logistics men do not ask, "How do I catch them?" They ask a different question. He asked, "How does a kidney get from Henderson, Nevada, into a person, and who moves the box?" Here is the thing about a transplant that people who have never worked around one do not know. The organ is the least mobile part of the operation. Everything else moves. Donors move, recipients move, blood samples move, and they move on a clock, because a cross-match has to be run in a real laboratory before anyone is put to sleep, and that laboratory is almost never in the same building as the surgery. Pre-op serum, tissue samples, backup units of blood product, and after the operation, biopsy specimens for pathology. All of it travels in validated coolers with temperature loggers, because a laboratory will reject a specimen that arrived warm, and because accreditation requires it. Which means that a business like Halcombe Vantage, which was running paying patients through 3 small surgical centers in 2 states, had a courier problem. And courier problems are Emmett Denham's entire life. He did not have to guess who they used. He asked the industry. There are maybe 200 people in the country who do accredited clinical cold chain in that corridor, and a decent number of them had loaded on his dock or drunk his coffee at 3 in the morning at a fuel stop in Nebraska. The vendor was a Las Vegas outfit called Sunbelt Specimen Courier. 2 vans, a husband and wife, and an accreditation certificate that had been renewed on paper for 6 years. Emmett requested their public compliance record, which anyone can do. Then he did something that Callista Merrow made him write down and swear to afterward, because she wanted it absolutely clear that he had broken no law. He called Sunbelt and asked for a quote on a recurring run, as a competitor doing market research, which is legal and which he had done 100 times. The woman on the phone was friendly and tired and told him, without being asked, that they didn't use the loggers on the short hops because the labs never look at them and the units cost $40 apiece. Emmett wrote that down, hung up, and reported it in writing to the accrediting body, with a copy to the 2 reference laboratories Sunbelt served. He did not embellish it. He did not have to. Skipping continuous temperature monitoring on clinical specimens is not a gray area. It is the whole rule. And within 5 weeks, Sunbelt's accreditation was suspended pending audit, and both labs stopped accepting their deliveries. That is the entire trick, and it is not a trick at all. Emmett had simply reported a real violation that was really happening, which any honest competitor would have done, and which nobody had done in 6 years because nobody was paying attention. Now Halcombe Vantage needed an accredited cold chain vendor in the Las Vegas corridor, immediately, with a clean certificate and no curiosity. There was one. It was a small carrier out of Kingman, Arizona, called Redlands Validated Transport, 3 vans and a storage room, owned by a semi-retired refrigeration mechanic who had spent 31 years driving for Wendell Denham and then for his son. Booker Nance was 61, and when Emmett explained it to him at the kitchen table, all of it, including the part where a federal agent would have to be involved and the part where it could go wrong, Booker listened for a long time and then asked exactly one question. He asked, "Is the girl still on the machine?" Emmett said yes. Booker said, "Then quit talking." Redlands was real. That mattered more than anything. It had been a real company with real customers for 4 years. Emmett bought a minority interest through his own company, disclosed it in writing to Delia Okonkwo before a single dollar moved, and then did not touch operations at all, because Merrill was emphatic. The evidence would be worthless if a defense attorney could say the government's cooperating witness was driving the van. So Booker drove, and Booker did what Booker always did, which was the job, properly, exactly as written. Every cooler that left a Halcom Vantage case got a numbered tamper-evidence seal, photographed at pickup with the manifest visible in the frame, a continuous data logger inside, a GPS unit on the vehicle with door-open sensors, a signature capture on a tablet with a timestamp and location, copies to the customer, copies to the lab, copies retained for 7 years under the accreditation standard. Perfectly ordinary, legally required, completely devastating. Because for the next 4 months, the paperwork of Halcom Vantage's operation was created, time-stamped, geolocated, and preserved by a company that Porter Halcom had hired himself in a hurry. And every single record was the kind a court loves, business records, made in the regular course of business, by people with no idea what they would later mean. Delia Okonkwo told Emmett, months later, that in 11 years she had never had a case hand itself to her like that. She also told him that the reason it worked was not clever. It was that Porter Halcom had spent so long buying silence that it had never occurred to him that the most dangerous thing in the world is a vendor who simply follows the rules. The pattern came out of the data in 6 weeks. A case would begin with a specimen run from a hotel, not a clinic, a hotel. Pre-op serum drawn in a room at a suites property off Paradise Road, picked up by Booker, delivered to a reference lab under a patient name. Then, 8 to 10 days later, a second run from the same hotel with a different name on the manifest but the same room number. Then a surgical center. Then, 48 hours after that, a biopsy specimen going out under the recipient's name, and the recipient's name was never American. Emmett laid the runs against Neve's photographed ledger. Every line matched, 2 letters for the center, a first name, which was the donor's real name, a second name in parentheses, which was the identity on the paperwork, a number, which was what the donor was actually paid, 41 lines, 29 of them in the previous 3 years. Line 19 read TS, ED, 11,000. And on the 14th of July, a new line appeared in the data, before it appeared in anyone's ledger, because Booker picked up a pre-op serum draw from room 1114 at a hotel on Paradise Road at 6:52 in the morning, and the manifest that came with it, filled out by a Halcom Vantage coordinator in a hurry, listed the donor as a directed living donor. The name on the manifest was Emmett Denham. They had reused him. Of course they had. He was their best paper, a clean name that had already survived 1 audit. Emmett was standing in his own yard in Ohio, on a Tuesday, with 2 kidneys, holding a phone with a photograph on it of a document that said he was in a hotel room in Las Vegas, about to give one away. He forwarded it to Delia Okonkwo without a single word of commentary, because it did not need any, and because his father had taught him that the strongest thing you can ever hand somebody is a record that speaks for itself. The last run happened on a Thursday in late July, and it happened the way Delia Okonkwo wanted it to happen, which was boringly. There was no raid on the hotel. There was no man in a windbreaker kicking a door. The donor in room 11114 was a 31-year-old landscaper from Bullhead City named Reuben, and the entire object of the operation was to make sure that nobody removed anything from Reuben at all. So at 7:40 in the morning, 2 agents and a nurse from the Nevada Board of Medical Examiners knocked on his door and sat with him for 2 hours. And by 9 o'clock, he had a lawyer and an interpreter and a copy of what he had signed. And by 10, he had understood that the $18,000 was not a stipend for kindness. He cried, and then he asked whether he was going to prison, and Okonkwo said no, and meant it, and kept her word. Cascade Meridian Surgical was served that afternoon. So was a second center in Bullhead City. So was the office of Halcom Vantage on the 11th floor of a building in Denver, with a view of the mountains and a reception area with a live olive tree in it. Porter Halcom was not arrested that day. Federal cases do not work that way. What happened instead was slower and, Emmett came to think, worse for a man like Porter. The seizure of every server, the freezing of the operating accounts, and a preservation letter to every bank he touched, followed by 4 months of absolute silence, in which nothing at all happened to him, except that his life kept quietly ending. The notebook came out of the drawer in the search. Neve had photographed 11 pages. There were 34, 61 lines, 61 people. The hearing that Emmett actually cared about, though, was not the criminal one. It was a smaller room with worse chairs. In September, the Regional Review Board that oversees living donor programs held a session in Denver on the accreditation of the 2 surgical centers, and the government's presentation was largely documents, and part of the documents were the transport records of Redland's validated transport, and Emmett was called to authenticate them because he was a principal of the company. He had brought a cooler. It was one of his own, the medium size, and he set it on the table in front of him and did not open it, and for about 9 minutes nobody asked, which he had counted on, because he had put it there at the beginning, specifically so that it would sit in everyone's peripheral vision. He authenticated the records. He explained, in the plainest language he had, what a tamper-evident seal is, and why a seal number written on a manifest at 6:52 in the morning in Las Vegas is a fact rather than an opinion. He explained a data logger. He explained that his industry exists because at some point, people decided that a human being's memory is not good enough when the thing in the box is a person's life. Then the board chair asked him if there was anything else. Emmett said, "I'd like to explain what's in the cooler." He opened it. There was no organ in it. There was no ice. There was a stack of paper, 11 inches high, in 41 folders, and each folder had a name on the tab. He said, "These are the consent forms. Every one of them is signed by a person who was not the person named on it. 41 so far. The government has more." He picked up the folder labeled with his own name and held it. He said, "This one is mine. I have never been to Nevada. I have both my kidneys." On the 3rd of September, 2023, a 24-year-old man named Teodoro Salcido had his left kidney removed in a building in Henderson, and my name was written on the paperwork, and because of that, he does not have a medical history, and I do not have a body that the computer believes in. He put the folder down. He said, "I want the board to understand what that second part means, because it's the part nobody sees. My daughter is 9. She has been on dialysis for 10 months. I am a half match to her. I am healthy, and I am willing. And for 2 years, if I had walked into any transplant center in this country and offered, a computer would have looked at the national registry and rejected me in under a second, because the registry said I had already given a kidney away." He looked at the table. He said, "They didn't do that to me by accident. They picked me because I was quiet. They took a man's kidney and put my name on it, and the same signature that made them money took me off the list of people who could save my own child. That's not fraud on a program. That's the 2 of them reaching 4 years into the future to make sure that when the worst day came, she wouldn't have me." Nobody said anything for a while. Fitzamaro told him afterward that in 18 years of hospital law, he had never heard a room go that quiet, and that the cooler was theatrical, and that it worked, because Emmett clearly had no idea it was theatrical. Cascade Meridian Surgical lost its accreditation in November and closed in January. Dr. Wallace Krogh surrendered his license in 2 states and was later sentenced to 70 months. Porter Halcomb was indicted in February on charges including conspiracy, the acquisition of human organs for valuable consideration under the National Organ Transplant Act, healthcare fraud, aggravated identity theft, and money laundering. He fought it for 14 months with 3 law firms, and then pleaded when the 61 folders became 61 witnesses. He was sentenced to 17 years, and the judge's remarks at sentencing were read aloud on a podcast Emmett does not listen to. Tessa Halcomb pleaded guilty to conspiracy and to wrongfully obtaining individually identifiable health information for personal gain. She was sentenced to 41 months. She filed for divorce 11 days after the ethics committee meeting. Emmett has always found that detail strange, because she filed before she knew the extent of it, before the notebook, before Teo. She filed the week she found out about a signature on a page. He thinks about that sometimes. He thinks it means that on some level, she had known for a long time what she was married to, and that 7 words from a surgeon had simply removed the last comfortable place to put her eyes. None of that is the ending, though, because none of that got a 9-year-old off a machine. The record did. It took 11 weeks, which Emmett will tell you was 11 weeks too long, and which everyone who works in that world will tell you was miraculously fast. The Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network does not simply delete things. A living donor registration is a permanent safety record, and it is supposed to be almost impossible to remove. And that is correct, and Emmett would not want it any other way. So it was not deleted, it was corrected. The registration was amended to reflect the true donor, Teodoro Salcido, with his consent and at his request, which meant three things at once. It meant Emmett Denham became, on paper, a man with 2 kidneys again. It meant Teo Salcido became, on paper, a living donor, with a permanent medical history that emergency rooms could see, with the lifetime follow-up he was entitled to, and with the priority status on the national waiting list that every living donor in America carries in case their remaining kidney ever fails. And it meant that the first thing the system did, when it finally told the truth, was protect the man it had been used to erase. Emmett considers that the single best outcome of the entire affair, and he will say so, and he will get slightly irritated if you disagree. Dr. Haugen reopened his workup in October. He passed everything. The final cross-match was negative. He was a 3-antigen match to his daughter, which is exactly what a father should be, and which had never once been in doubt by anyone except a computer. The surgery was on the 6th of December. Marin was 10 by then. She had a whiteboard in her room, with a countdown on it, and she had made her list into a laminated card. Number 4 was still drink a whole entire large soda. Number 7 had been amended in different ink to see my dad's trucks and sit in the one with the sleeper. The night before, Emmett sat on the end of her bed the way he had the first day, and she asked him if he was scared, and he told her the truth, which was yes, and she said, of the surgery, and he said, no. He said he was scared she would not want him afterward, once she was well and the whole thing was over, and he was just a guy from Ohio again. Marin thought about that with her whole face, the way she thought about everything. Then she said, that's stupid, and Emmett laughed so hard a nurse came in. They took his left kidney out laparoscopically at 6:40 in the morning. It was in his daughter by 9:15. It made urine on the table, which is the thing surgeons watch for and get quietly emotional about, and Dr. Haugen said it did so almost immediately, which she described as enthusiastic. Emmett woke up at 12:20 in the afternoon and asked the first question, and the recovery nurse, who had been told what to say, said, she's making urine, and Emmett Denham put his hands over his face and stayed like that for a while. Tessa was in the building that day. She was 17 days from reporting to a federal facility in Illinois, and she sat in a family waiting area on the 3rd floor for 11 hours, alone, because Porter's family had stopped taking her calls in April. Emmett did not speak to her. He has never sought her out, but he did one thing, and he did it 4 days later when he was upright and shuffling around the ward with a pillow against his abdomen, and it is the only part of this story where he says he does not entirely know his own reasons. He had a nurse take a photograph of Marin, awake, sitting up, holding a plastic cup with a straw in it, and he wrote on the back of the printout, in pen, she's okay, and had it walk down to the 3rd floor. He says it was not forgiveness. He is very clear about that. He says he has not forgiven her and does not expect to, and that anyone who tells you forgiveness is mandatory is selling something. He says he did it because a person was sitting in a room for 11 hours waiting for information about a child, and he knows exactly what that is like, and he was not willing to be a man who could do that to somebody on purpose. Marin Denham went home in 19 days. Her creatinine is normal. She takes immunosuppressants every 12 hours and will for the rest of her life, and she has an alarm on her phone with a song she picked out herself. She lives in Tolliver, Ohio, now, in a house next to a gravel lot with 4 trucks in it. Emmett got full custody in May, uncontested, in a hearing that lasted 11 minutes. Teo Salcido moved to Ohio in the spring. He runs the validated storage room at Denham Cold Chain, which does not require lifting, and he is the best documentation man Emmett has ever employed, and there is a reason for that which neither of them says out loud. His mother's insulin is handled. He has a nephrologist in Columbus, and he goes every 3 months. Booker Nance still drives. He will not accept a raise. And there is a laminated sheet taped inside the door of every truck in that yard, which Emmett wrote and which the drivers make fun of, and it says what it has always said, in his father's words and now in his. The box either stayed cold or it didn't. You can lie to a person. You cannot lie to a logger. Write it down while it's true. It's Nathan again. I've been sitting with this one for a couple of days, and I want to tell you what I think it's actually about. Because it isn't organs, and it isn't even betrayal. It's about the difference between being believed and being provable. Emmett Denham spent 4 years being disbelieved. He was disbelieved by a court, by his ex-wife's lawyer, by 208 unopened envelopes, and eventually by a computer that had been fed a lie about his own body. And none of his goodness helped him, not 1 hour of it. What helped him was that he had spent his whole life building the habit of writing things down while they were still true. And when the moment came, he did not have to be believed, because he could show you. I think that's the takeaway. And I think it's a hard one, because we're raised to believe that being right is enough. It isn't. Being right and having a record is enough. Keep your receipts, keep your logs, keep the boring copies of the boring emails. Not because you're paranoid, but because someday you may need to prove something about your own life to a stranger who has no reason to trust you. And on that day, sincerity will be worth nothing, and documentation will be worth everything. And the other thing, the one I can't stop thinking about. They didn't take him off that list because they hated him. They took him off because a man who saves your child is a man you owe forever, and they'd rather she suffered than be in his debt. That's the real face of this kind of person. It's not rage, it's arithmetic. If this one got you, subscribe, because I've got more, and honestly, they get worse. Take care of each other.